I have always considered myself a fair-minded person. Others may call me controlling or cynical, but in a world where people are cheated every day, only fools believe in selflessness. At 73, I have every right to make such judgments. Life has taught me to see through people. My career as a probate lawyer has been built on an understanding of human nature. For 38 years, I've watched families fall apart over money. Brothers and sisters who haven't spoken to each other in years suddenly become sworn enemies over grandma's brooch or grandpa's antique desk. People are predictable in their greed. My office in downtown Brooklyn Park was known to every wealthy person within a 50-mile radius. If you want to protect your inheritance, go to Drummond, they told each other. And I did. I drafted impeccable wills, created trusts that couldn't be challenged, found loopholes in the law that other lawyers didn't even realize were there. My work didn't always bring me friends, but respect. Shelley, my late wife, often said that I treated my clients with more consideration than I did my own family. Perhaps there was some truth to that. When cancer took her 15 years ago in a measly 6 months, I realized I had lost the one person who accepted me for who I was. She knew all my flaws and loved me anyway. After she left, my big house on Oregon Avenue became too empty and too quiet. Our son Elliot was living on his own by then. He never wanted to follow in my footsteps, preferring financial analytics, a field where, in his words, value is created, not redistributed. This was the first indication that he was ashamed of my profession, as if defending legal inheritance rights was something to be ashamed of. I never told him how many times his private school, his college, and his first apartment were paid for by these very redistributed values. The relationship with Elliot has always been complicated. When he was a kid, I was too busy building a career. When he became a teenager, I was too strict, trying to make up for years of neglect. When he got older, there was already a chasm of miscommunication between us that Shelley tried to bridge with her family dinners and holidays. After her death, my son and I communicated mostly by phone, seeing each other only at Christmas and Thanksgiving. And then Pearl came along. 5 years ago, Elliot had brought her to my house for Thanksgiving, a slender woman with a straight posture and an appraising gaze. She was a curator at the Riverbrook Art Gallery, and from the way she held herself, she considered herself a connoisseur of all things beautiful. "Austin," she held out her hand to me, her long fingers adorned with a single ring with a small sapphire. "We've finally met. Elliot has told me so much about you." There was that special tone in her voice that I'd learned to recognize over the years, a slight note of falseness. Elliot never told me much about me, especially not to the women he dated. I knew right away that this one was trying to impress. "I hope not all of it's true," I replied with the smile I used when negotiating with particularly difficult clients. Over dinner, she talked about the contemporary art exhibit she was curating. I listened to her talk about the texture of the canvas and dialogue with the void, and I saw Elliot looking at her with the same mixture of admiration and uncertainty that he had once looked at me as a child. "What do you think of modern art, Austin?" she asked at one point. "I think most of these artists can't draw," I replied, cutting off a piece of turkey, "and they call it conceptual." Elliot tensed, and a strange smile appeared on Pearl's face. "It's a very traditional," she said, as if traditional were synonymous with outdated. 3 months later, they were married. The ceremony was modest in an urban garden with minimalist decor and no traditional exchange of vows. Elliot looked happy, but somehow lost, as if he didn't fully understand how he'd gotten here. After the wedding, their visits had been regular but strained. Pearl always found an excuse to mention my outdated taste or conservative views. Elliot remained silent, avoiding conflict as he always did. I could see her gradually distancing him from me, politely but persistently. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner when they had already left, I sat in my office with a glass of whiskey and stared at Shelley's picture. "She's taking him away," I said aloud, "and he's not even fighting back." That's when the idea came to me, first as a joke, then as a thought experiment, and then as a full-blown plan. I'd never been a vindictive person, but I believed everyone should get what they deserved. If Pearl wanted to play on my field, she should have known the rules of the game. The next day I made inquiries about the Riverbrook Gallery, a small but prestigious establishment specializing in contemporary art. The owner is Taylor Wade, an elderly art lover already thinking about retirement. A few phone calls to old clients, and I had an appointment with Wade at his country home. I hadn't thought about selling, to be honest, he said as we sat on his veranda overlooking the lake. But at my age, everything has a price. I understand, I nodded, and I'm willing to offer a very good one. We discussed the details, and 2 weeks later, I became the secret owner of the Riverbrook Gallery. Taylor agreed to stay on as nominal director for a year so that the transition wouldn't be obvious. Pearl continued working, unaware that I was now her real boss. But that was just the beginning. The real part of the plan required more time and finesse. I started small. I invited Elliot to lunch. Just him, without Pearl. At the restaurant, after a second glass of wine, I talked about his work, his successes. "You're doing great, son. I'm proud of you." Words I'd rarely said to him before. He looked at me with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Father. That means a lot to me. I know I've been hard on you, maybe too hard, but only because I wanted the best for you." Elliot nodded, not quite convinced but willing to listen. I continued. "I've been thinking about helping you and Pearl. Financially." His eyebrows rose. "We're coping." "Of course you are. But why don't you let me help with a few things? Like gifts for your wife." "Gifts?" "Yeah. Women like pretty things. And I know some good jewelers, antique dealers. I could give you money for something special for Pearl." He hesitated, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. Pride versus the desire to please his wife. "It's just a gift from a father to his son," I added. "Nothing more." In the end, he agreed. But I put one small condition. Legally, all these gifts will be registered in my name, for tax optimization. Elliot, who had never been interested in the legal intricacies, didn't ask any questions. It was enough that he could give Pearl things he could never have afforded himself. Over the next 4 years, I financed many gifts. Antique emerald earrings for their first anniversary, a rare graphic by a little-known but promising artist for her birthday, a vintage Cartier watch for Christmas. The list grew, as did my secret collection of things that technically belonged to me, but were in Pearl's use. She never expressed her gratitude directly to me, but I could see how proudly she wore these things, how she flaunted them during visits. I was especially amused when she told her friends about Elliot's generosity in my presence, unaware of who was really behind the gifts. I waited, patiently, like a good hunter, and I knew that sooner or later there would come a moment when all the cards would be revealed. In the meantime, I just enjoyed the feeling of control I'd loved so much my whole life. After all, I've always been a man who knows how to wait, and a planner. Pearl had yet to learn that. The invitation to Elliot's birthday party came via email. Pearl had chosen a template with falling confetti and balloons, so bright and festive that my eyes watered when I opened it on my computer. "It is our pleasure to invite you to celebrate Elliot's 45th birthday at our home," the text read. At the bottom were their names, Elliot and Pearl Drummond, though I was sure my son had had nothing to do with drafting the message. My finger hovered over the delete button. I could pretend I'd never gotten the invitation, or say I had a doctor's appointment, or simply reply that I didn't feel well enough to go out. After all, at my 73 years old, no one would be surprised, but something made me hit reply. "I'd be happy to attend, Austin." No exclamation points, no emotion, just a statement of fact. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. It was a cold April in Brooklyn Park, and the trees were just starting to turn a pale green haze. Elliot's birthday was the following Saturday, April 20th. In 5 days, I was to sit around the table with Pearl and probably a couple or three of their friends whom I hardly knew, and pretend to be a happy father. Pearl loved organizing such parties, with carefully chosen menus, music, and the obligatory group photos that would then appear on her social media accounts. "Family dinner with my favorite father-in-law," she captioned the photos, and every time I suppressed the urge to write in the comments that I was her only father-in-law, so the epithet favorite sounds at least redundant. I understood her game perfectly well. She created the illusion of an ideal family. Loving husband, caring wife, attentive father-in-law. All together, all smiling, all happy. A beautiful picture for the outside world that had nothing to do with reality. In reality, Elliot was too immersed in his work to notice how his wife was systematically alienating him from his father. In reality, Pearl took every opportunity to remind me that I was just a guest in their life, not a permanent part of it. And in reality, I planned to teach her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. But first, I had to pick out a gift for my son. I walked over to the bookcase and pulled out a heavy leather volume with gold embossing on the spine. The Drummond Family Genealogy, From Scotland to America, the title read. The book, published in 1932 in a limited edition, contained the history of our family from the 17th century onward. My father gave it to me when I turned 21, saying, "Austin, remember who you are and where you came from. That's your strength." I was never particularly close to my father. Woodrow Drummond was a man of stern and few words, spending more time in his law office than at home. When he spoke, everyone listened. When he made a ruling, no one dared challenge it. To me, he was both a hero and a tyrant, a role model and someone I feared becoming. Now, flipping through the yellowed pages of the book, I realized that I had unwittingly repeated his path with Elliot. The same rigor, the same high expectations, the same disappointment when his son chose a different path in life. I remember Elliot as a child following me around whenever I let him in my office. His eyes would open wide at the sight of the impressive stacks of documents on my desk, the hundreds of law books on the shelves, the clients who spoke to me in a respectful tone. "Daddy, am I going to be a lawyer like you?" he asked, perched on a leather visitor's chair, his feet not even reaching the floor. "If you study hard," I answered, keeping my eyes on the papers. He was a good student, excellent to be exact, always in the top 3 of his class, winner of math Olympiads, captain of the school debate team. I demanded excellence from him, and I got it, though I realize now at what cost. When he was 15, I found him crying in his room after he got a B on a chemistry test. "It's just one grade, Elliot," I said, standing awkwardly in the doorway of his room. "You don't understand," he sobbed. I can't get B's. You'll be disappointed." I dismissed his words at the time, writing it off as adolescent maximalism. It wasn't until years later that I realized the pressure I was putting on my son without even thinking about it. When Elliot announced at his high school graduation party that he wanted to study finance instead of law, I took it as a personal insult. We had a big fight, and Shelley had to come between us to prevent the conflict from escalating further. "Austin, he has a right to choose his path," she said later, when we were alone. "He's choosing wrong," I replied stubbornly. "The Drummonds have always been lawyers. It's a legacy. Or maybe it's time to create a new legacy." I didn't heed her words. Instead, I cut Elliot's financial support during his college years, forcing him to work part-time as a waiter in the evenings. It was my form of punishment for disobedience. Even though Shelley was secretly sending him money, I did my job of planting guilt in him that he carries to this day. After graduating from college, Elliot moved quickly up the career ladder. He was smart and hardworking, qualities that are valued in any field. By the time he was 30, he was a senior financial analyst at a prestigious company. I should have been proud of him, and somewhere deep inside I really was. But I couldn't bring myself to recognize that he had succeeded without my guidance, along a path I didn't approve of. Our relationship consisted of short phone calls and occasional meetings during which we discussed the weather, sports, politics, everything except what really mattered. Shelley was a buffer between us, softening the sharp edges, finding topics of conversation where we couldn't quarrel. After her death, we were left alone with our inability to truly communicate. Elliot called out of obligation. I answered out of stubbornness. We became two polite strangers, connected only by last name. And then Pearl came along. With her arrival, I felt like I was losing even the ghostly connection to my son that we still had. She looked at me as a relic of the past, an unwelcome element in their modern lives. And worst of all, Elliot was starting to look at me through her eyes. Placing the book on the table, I ran my fingers over the embossed cover. This gift held a special meaning for me, though I'd never told my son about it. The book traveled with me through my life: college, law school, first office, marriage to Shelley, Elliot's birth. It was a constant in a changing world, a reminder of the roots and traditions I valued so much. I knew Pearl wouldn't appreciate such a gift. To her, it would be just an old book, perhaps even a dusty relic of the past, as she once called my collection of Hemingway first editions. But it wasn't a gift for her. It was a gift for my son, a symbol of the legacy I wanted to pass on to him, whether he followed in my footsteps or not. Sure, I could have bought him something modern, a new expensive gadget, or designer cufflinks, or a season ticket to a high-end golf club, something that would win Pearl's approval and therefore his pleasure. But it would be a gift for both of them, not for him personally. I carefully wrapped the book in heavy paper and tied it with a dark blue ribbon. No flashy gift wrapping, no huge bow, no card with enthusiastic wishes. A simple, elegant gift from father to son, just as it had been when my father passed it on to me. On Elliot's birthday, I was going to be a polite guest. I would smile at pictures of Pearl. I would praise her cooking skills. I would make small talk with their friends. But when it came time to give gifts, I would hand this book to my son and, perhaps for the first time in a long time, say something sincere to him, something real. And if Pearl decides that this gift isn't good enough, well, that will only confirm my opinion of her, and will make what follows even more justifiable. I set the wrapped book on the shelf in the study and went back to the window. The April rain had begun to drizzle, leaving wet paths on the glass. 5 days until my birthday. 5 days until the moment that could change everything. For better or worse, I didn't know yet. But I was prepared for either outcome. After all, I'd spent a lifetime preparing people for unexpected twists of fate. It was time to apply that skill to my own family. Elliot's birthday was surprisingly warm for April. I arrived at their house at 6 p.m. Sharp, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. The driveway was lined with cars, mostly German and Japanese sedans, the choice of Brooklyn Park's successful middle class. My old Lincoln looked like a dinosaur among them, but I'd never sought to follow automobile fashion. Pearl opened the door, wearing a dark blue dress that emphasized her slim figure. She wore a necklace of sapphires around her neck, one of the gifts Elliot had given her last Christmas, a gift I'd paid for. Austin, she leaned over and touched her cheek to my cheek, our traditional imitation of a kiss. How nice of you to be able to come. I don't miss my son's birthdays, I replied, handing her the bottle of wine I'd brought as an addition to the main gift. Of course, her smile didn't affect her eyes. Come on in. Everyone's already gathered. Everyone turned out to be 6 couples between the ages of 35 and 50. Elliot's colleagues and their spouses, a couple of neighbors, and, to my surprise, Vince Harper, a former client of mine, and his wife. Vince was an art and antiques dealer, and it was through him that I had purchased several items for the Pearl collection. When our gazes met, he nodded slightly, a professional acknowledgement without emotion. Elliot walked over to me with a glass in his hand. He looked good, tan from a recent business trip to Florida, in a pressed white shirt and dark pants. At 45, he still retained his youthful slimness, though his hair was already showing gray at the temples. Dad, he shook my hand, then, unexpectedly for both of us, gave me a brief hug. I'm glad you came. Happy birthday, son. I patted him on the back. You look good. Thank you, he smiled. Come on, I'll pour you something. Pearl had the cocktails ready. I let myself be led to the bar set up in the corner of the living room. Of course, Pearl made cocktails, probably some fancy mixes with exotic ingredients and fancy names. I asked for a simple scotch on the rocks, which earned me a barely perceptible smile from my son. Some things never change, he said, pouring me a 12-year-old Glenfiddich. I don't see the point in changing what works, I replied, accepting the glass. The next hour passed in small talk. I kept up conversation with the guests, discussed the latest political news with the husband of one of Elliot's colleagues, listened to their neighbor's enthusiastic account of her trip to Provence. Pearl walked between the guests with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, playing the role of the perfect hostess. From time to time, she glanced in my direction, checking to see if I was spoiling the atmosphere with my presence. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock. The table was decorated with candles and fresh flowers, and the plates were arranged with geometric precision. Pearl had obviously spent a lot of time creating the perfect picture. I was seated across from the birthday boy, which was probably meant to symbolize my father's special position. In fact, it meant that I was always in sight of Pearl, who sat at Elliot's right hand. Everyone, please raise your glasses, she announced when everyone was seated. to my wonderful husband, who is celebrating his birthday today. Elliot, you are the kindest, smartest, most caring man I know. I am grateful every day for having you in my life." The guests raised their glasses and cheers of "To Elliot" were heard. I raised my glass too, met my eyes with my son's and nodded. He smiled slightly, clearly embarrassed by all the attention. Dinner was going smoothly. Pearl had prepared a 3-course menu, some kind of exotic salad, medium-rare steaks, and a chocolate dessert. The food was good, though a bit too pretentious for my taste. Between servings, the guests exchanged stories about Elliot, funny incidents from work, memories of trips together. I remained silent, realizing that my stories about my son were from a period that none of those present knew. Finally, it was time for presents. Pearl brought a large basket filled with beautifully wrapped boxes. "Who wants to be first?" she asked, looking around at the guests. "I think the birthday boy's father has the right to be first," Vince said, raising his glass toward me. All eyes turned to me. I calmly pulled my present, still wrapped in plain paper with a blue ribbon, from my inside jacket pocket and handed it to Elliot across the table. "Happy birthday, son," I said. It had been passed from Drummond to Drummond for nearly 100 years. Pearl faintly wrinkled her nose. She was obviously expecting something more impressive, perhaps in a big, beautiful box. Elliot untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the paper. When he saw the book, his eyebrows rose slightly. "The Drummond family genealogy," he read aloud, running his fingers over the gold embossing. "My father gave it to me when I turned 21, I said. "His father gave it to him. Now it's yours." Elliot opened the book, flipped through a few pages. "Thank you, Dad," he said finally. There was sincerity in his voice, but I could see that he didn't quite understand the significance of the gift. It's an important part of our history." "Interesting." Pearl leaned over to get a better look at the book, her smile strained. "What an educational thing to read." I knew she was disappointed. Vince, understanding the atmosphere better than anyone, quickly offered his gift, a rare bottle of Japanese whiskey. Other gifts followed: expensive cufflinks, tickets to a baseball game, a gift certificate to a men's clothing store. The humble book was lost among this splendor. When all the gifts were delivered, Pearl suggested we move to the living room for coffee and dessert. I lingered at the table, finishing my scotch, when I noticed that the book remained lying among the wrapping paper, forgotten in the commotion. The evening continued. The guests began to leave around 11, thanking their hosts for a wonderful evening. I was about to leave too, but I decided to find Elliot first to say goodbye in person. He wasn't in the living room. I headed toward the kitchen, where the voices were coming from. The door was ajar, and I was about to enter when I heard Pearl say, "And that's all he could give you? A dusty old book?" I stopped listening. "Pearl, it's important to him." Elliot's voice sounded tired. "It's a family heirloom." "An heirloom? It's just old junk, Elliot. He could have gotten you something worthwhile for your 45th birthday. But no, he brought this junk to remind you of his precious Drummonds. Like that means anything these days." I heard the sound of a lid opening, a garbage can. "Pearl, don't," Elliot said, a faint note of protest in his voice. "Why not? You'll never read it anyway, and I'm not going to keep that dust in our house." There was a thud as the book fell into the trash can. "That's it. Problem solved," Pearl said. I pushed open the door and stepped into the kitchen. Both of them froze when they saw me. Pearl was standing by the trash can, Elliot by the kitchen island with an empty glass in his hand. "Dad," Elliot began, his face pale. "We were just cleaning up after the party," Pearl finished for him, trying to keep her composure. "Are you leaving already, Austin?" I slowly walked over to the trash can and looked inside. The book was lying on top of a pile of used napkins and food scraps. "Valuable stuff," I said, taking the book out and shaking it off. "First edition, 1932nd year. You can only find one of these at auctions now, and it's worth a lot." "Look, Austin," Pearl began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "No, Pearl, you listen. I pretended not to notice your disdain when you called my gift an educational item. I remained silent when you didn't even bother to put it aside with the other gifts. But to hear you call a family heirloom old trash and throw it away, that's just too much." "Dad," Elliot stepped forward. Pearl didn't mean to. Oh, that's exactly what she wanted, son. I shifted my gaze to my daughter-in-law. You've never respected me or my family, Pearl. From the beginning, you've seen me as a nuisance, an outdated relic of the past. But you know what's interesting? While you were demonstrating your superiority, I was watching and planning. What are you talking about? Elliot asked, his voice sounding worried. That, Elliot, all those beautiful gifts you've given your wife over the years, the sapphire necklace she's wearing now, the antique emerald earrings, the paintings in your living room, the vintage Cartier watch, all of it legally belongs to me. Pearl's face changed, disbelief replaced by alarm. What kind of nonsense are you talking? The truth, I turned to my son. Do you remember, Elliot, when I offered to help you with Pearl's presents? How I gave you the money for all those expensive things? Remember how you signed some documents without reading them because you trusted your old father? Elliot's eyes widened. Those documents, they were the deeds, I finished for him. Everything you gave Pearl with my money legally belongs to me. I was just letting you use those things. Pearl went pale, her hand automatically reaching for the necklace around her neck. You can't do that. These are my things. Elliot gave them to me. I can, I replied calmly. And I will. What's more, I paused, savoring the moment. I also own the Riverbrook Gallery. She stared at me, her face contorted with shock. What? I bought the gallery from Taylor Wade 4 years ago. Through a front man, of course. Technically, Pearl, I'm your employer. Elliot slumped in his chair, his face turning ash gray. Why, Dad? Why did you do it? To teach a lesson, I answered, looking directly at Pearl. A lesson in respect and an understanding of who's really in control here. Pearl gripped the edge of the kitchen island, her fingers turning white. You're crazy, she whispered. You're a sick, controlling old man. Maybe, I agreed, heading for the exit with book in hand. But now you know who you're dealing with and how much your disregard for old trash is really worth. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them in a daze. Grabbed my coat from the coat closet and left the house without looking back. Getting into my car, I put my book on the seat next to me and took a deep breath. It had been a long evening, but it had been worth it. The look on Pearl's face when she realized the truth was exactly what I'd been waiting for all these years. Pearl wanted to get rid of the old garbage, but she didn't realize she was about to lose everything she held dear. All because she didn't know who I really was, not just an old father-in-law, but a man who always gets what he wants. After that night, I didn't hear from them for 2 days. They were quiet days spent reading and walking around the neighborhood. I knew that the bomb I had planted had already gone off, and now all that was left to do was watch the aftermath. On the 3rd day, the phone rang. It was Elliot. His voice sounded hoarse, like he'd been awake the whole time. We need to talk, he said without preamble. Of course, son, I answered, looking at the Drummond family tree book I'd rescued from the trash on the shelf. When do you want to meet? Tonight, 2 o'clock, at your place. He hung up without waiting for my answer. This was new. Elliot usually avoided confrontation, especially with me. At 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw them both. Elliot with dark circles under his eyes and Pearl, pale but determined. I stepped back silently, letting them into the house. Have a seat, I suggested, pointing to the chairs in the living room. They sat side by side on the couch, Pearl clutching her husband's hand as if she were afraid he might disappear. I settled into my favorite chair across from them, preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. Pearl wants to hear the whole truth, Elliot began, his voice sounding tired. I've already told her what I know, but it's not enough. I nodded, looking at my sister-in-law. What exactly do you want to know, Pearl? Everything, she stepped forward, looking me straight in the eye. I want to know how long you've been planning this revenge, and why. What have I done to you to deserve this? I leaned back in my chair, gathering my thoughts. It started about 4 years ago, I began calmly. Shortly after you publicly criticized my book collection at a family Thanksgiving dinner, calling it museum dust. I decided to find out more about you and discovered that you work at Riverbrook Gallery. Taylor Wade was just looking for a buyer. And you bought the gallery just to control me? Pearl looked shocked. Not only that, I shrugged. It was a good investment. But yes, I admit, I like the idea that I could influence your career. Did you try to sabotage my work? Block my exhibitions? Pearl straightened, her eyes narrowing. On the contrary, I smiled. I've supported your initiatives, promoted your projects through the board of directors. Your last exhibition of young artists was approved because of my influence. Pearl looked confused. But, why? So you could stay on the job, of course, so that I can keep an eye on you through my confidants. And because, oddly enough, you're a really good handler. Elliot shook his head. And the gifts? Why did you have to register them in your name? I shifted my gaze to my son. Do you remember our conversation 4 years ago, when I offered to help you with Pearl's presents? You said it was just a gift from father to son, he said, bitterness in his voice. But what you really did was make me sign. You signed the papers willingly, I interrupted him. I never forced you to do it. You just never bothered to read what you were signing. Too trusting, as usual. Pearl let go of Elliot's hand and stood up, starting to pace around the room. So, all this time, when I thought these presents were a show of my husband's love and care, it was really your game. Not exactly, I looked at my son. Elliot chose these gifts himself, taking into account your tastes. He really wanted to make you happy. It's just that the money was mine, and I made a condition. And you agreed to it. Pearl turned to her husband, her eyes filling with tears. How could you? Elliot lowered his head. I wanted to give you beautiful things, Pearl. Things you deserve. On my salary, I couldn't afford anything like that. Is that what this is about? She interrupted him. You let your father manipulate us because you wanted to impress me? Because you were afraid I wouldn't love you without expensive gifts? It's not just about gifts, I interjected. It's about control. It's about influence. You both thought you could just cut me out of your lives, create your own perfect little world where old Austin Drummond is just an inconvenient relative who's only invited to the holidays out of a sense of duty. Pearl turned to me, a look of disgust on her face. You're a sick man. We never tried to cut you out. We've invited you to every holiday, every family dinner. Out of politeness, I grinned, not out of a sincere desire for my presence. What did you expect? She raised her voice. You've always been cold and critical, always looking down on me, like I wasn't good enough for your precious son. Were you? I asked quietly. Dad! Elliot jumped up from the couch. That's enough. There was a heavy silence. Pearl stepped back to the window, turning away from both of us. Her shoulders shook. Tell me the truth, Elliot, she said at last without turning around. Did you know about all this? About the gallery? That the gifts really belonged to him? No, he shook his head. I swear, Pearl, I didn't know about the gallery and about the gifts. I knew I'd signed some papers, but I thought it was just a formality. My father said it was more tax efficient. I didn't understand. You didn't understand because you didn't want to understand. I stood up and walked over to the fireplace, looking at the family photos on the mantelpiece. You always avoided uncomfortable conversations, son. Always looking for the easy way out. Elliot clenched his fists, and for a moment I thought he might hit me, but instead he took a deep breath and turned to his wife. Pearl, it's my fault. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. I should have told you that the presents were bought with my father's money. But I was afraid you'd be disappointed. Pearl looked at him for a long moment. All this time, you've let your father pull your strings, like a puppet. And you, I turned to her, didn't you let ambition pull your strings? Isn't that why you were so hungry for those paintings and jewels? I don't have to explain myself to you, she snapped. No, you don't, I agreed. But now that the truth is out, you'll have a lot of explaining to do. I moved away from the fireplace and sat back in my chair. Watching them both realize the extent of my manipulation was strangely satisfying. Years of planning and waiting had finally borne fruit. What now? Pearl asked after a long silence. Will you take away all the presents? Will you dismiss me from the gallery? That's up to you, I answered, looking at my hands. On what you've learned from this lesson. Lesson? Elliot grinned. You call this a lesson? It's not a lesson, Dad. It's revenge. Dirty, calculated revenge. Call it what you want, I shrugged. The fact remains, I can take this stuff away anytime I want. I can fire Pearl with one phone call, and you both know it. Pearl walked over to the couch again and sat down next to her husband. You know what? Take it. Take all the goddamn jewelry, the paintings, the watches. They're not worth it. Pearl, Elliot started, but she interrupted him. No, Elliot, I'm not going to live under his control. I'm not going to wear my necklace every day knowing that it belongs to him. I smiled. Her pride had always been her weak spot. What about your career, Pearl? Are you willing to give that up too? She looked at me, her eyes narrowed. I'm a good curator. You've admitted that yourself. I'll find another gallery. In Brooklyn Park? I doubt it. I have connections to almost every gallery within a 50-mile radius. Then we'll move, she said firmly. We'll start over, without you and your control. Elliot looked at her in surprise, then at me. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear of the new, the unknown. All his life he'd relied on my support, even when he resisted my influence. You can't just, he started. I can, she interrupted, and I will. The question is, will you come with me, or will you stay under his control? It was the moment of truth. I watched my son's face, seeing his inner struggle. Part of me wanted him to stay, to choose me, to recognize my rightness. But the other part, the deeper and more honest part, knew that my actions had gone too far, that I might have lost his respect and love forever. I need to think, Elliot finally said, running his hand over his face. What was there to think about? Pearl stood up. It's a choice between me and him, between our future and his control. It's not that simple, Pearl, Elliot said tiredly. He's my father. The father who manipulated you your whole life. She shook her head. Who used you to get to me. I watched their altercation with a strange sense of detachment. I'd accomplished what I'd wanted to do, destroyed their idol, made Pearl feel vulnerable and dependent. But somehow the satisfaction I expected to feel was mixed with something else. An emptiness. That emptiness was familiar to me. I'd felt it after Shelley's death, when I realized I was alone in a big house full of memories. Felt it every time I watched Elliot drift away from me, choosing his own path instead of the one I had planned for him. Watching them argue, my son and his wife, I suddenly realized that my victory hadn't changed anything. I was still on my own, still controlling things instead of people, manipulating instead of just loving. I think you both should leave, I said finally, interrupting their argument. You have a lot to talk about, in private. They both looked at me, as if oblivious to my presence. Yes, we should go. Pearl picked up her bag. We really do have a lot to talk about. Elliot stood up, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Pain, disappointment, anger all mixed up in his eyes. You made your choice, Dad, he said quietly. Now I have to make mine. They left without saying goodbye. I stayed in the chair, staring at the door as it closed behind them. The house became quiet again. Too quiet. I realized that I may have just lost my son for good. And for what? For a moment of triumph over a woman I had never tried to truly know or understand. I walked to the window and watched them get into Elliot's car. They didn't speak, both staring straight ahead. My plan had worked even better than I'd expected. I'd shattered their idol, sowed distrust between them, showed Pearl who was really in control. But the price of that success was becoming clearer by the second. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if it was worth it. The week passed in silence. I didn't call them. They didn't call me. A couple times I wanted to dial Elliot's number, but I stopped myself. The ball was on their side of the field. On the 8th day, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors, and when I opened it, I was surprised to see Pearl on the doorstep, alone without Elliot. She looked focused and determined, dressed in a navy blue suit, the work clothes she usually wore to the gallery. Austin, she nodded. May I come in? I stepped back silently, letting her into the house. She walked into the living room and sat in the same chair where she'd sat a week ago, placing her bag neatly next to her. Does Elliot know you're here? I asked, sitting down across from her. Yes, she met my gaze squarely. It was my idea, but he was supportive. Interesting, I leaned back in my chair. And what brings you to me, Pearl? She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. I've come to propose a compromise. A compromise, I repeated, allowing myself a slight smile. How? I admit that I was disrespectful to you and your family history, she began, her voice smooth, as if she'd rehearsed the speech. The incident with the book was unacceptable, and I sincerely regret it. In exchange, I ask that you relinquish legal rights to my personal belongings and stop interfering with my career. I stared at her, studying every feature of her face. Proud, collected, in control of every word. Even in this moment, when she came to ask, she was trying to dictate terms. Was that it? I finally asked. A short, I'm sorry, and we're even. What more do you want? There was an irritation in her voice, which she immediately tried to hide. I'm ready to admit my mistake publicly, in front of Elliot, in front of your friends if necessary. I stood up and walked to the window, watching a pair of cardinals fussing at a bird feeder in the garden. The red flashes among the greenery seemed especially bright on this gray day. You know what I've always wondered about you, Pearl? I asked without turning around. Your self-righteousness. That your way of life, your values, your way of looking at the world is the only right way. It's not. From the first day you came into my son's life, I continued, ignoring her attempt to object, you began to change him, distancing him from me, from our family history, from everything that made him who he was. I never tried to change Elliot. She sounded resentful now. I loved him for who he was. That's not true, I turned to her. You loved the version of Elliot you created, the successful financial analyst, the perfect husband, the man who would fulfill your every whim. But the real Elliot is his father's son, heir to traditions you have no idea about. She shook her head. You speak as if he were your property, not an individual with his own desires and aspirations. And you speak as if you know him better than I do, I countered. I raised him. I saw how his character was formed, how he overcame difficulties, how he made decisions, both right and wrong, and controlled his every move, she added, keeping him from breathing, pressuring him with their expectations. I sat back in my chair, feeling the anger rising in me. You don't know anything about our relationship. I know enough, Pearl leaned forward. Elliot told me everything. How you punished him for his B's, how you cut his funding when he refused to study law, how you made him feel guilty for every decision that didn't go according to your plans. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest. Elliot never told me he felt all of this. He was always silent, acquiescent, compliant. He chose his own path, I said quietly. Under your pressure, Pearl straightened. And now you're doing the same thing. Pressuring, manipulating, trying to control both of us. I just want you to realize your mistake. My voice was sharper. To admit that you were wrong to throw away a family heirloom, to disrespect our family history, to alienate my son from me. I've already apologized for the book. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles turning white. But I won't apologize for loving your son and wanting the best for him. The best? I grinned. You think a life without a father is the best for him? A life without toxic control, yes. She didn't look away. Elliot deserves freedom from your manipulation. I stared at her, this young woman who dared to tell me what was best for my son. In that moment, I realized that no apology of hers would satisfy me. I didn't just want an admission of error. I wanted submission, an acknowledgement of my power over their lives. That's what I want, Pearl, I said at last. I want you to admit publicly that you've been a bad wife to Elliot, that your career and ambition always came before his well-being, that you failed to create a real family worthy of the Drummond family name. Her face contorted with shock. You're out of your mind. Those are my terms, I shrugged. Admit your failure as wife and daughter-in-law, and I'll give you back the legal rights to all your belongings. I'll give up control of the gallery. Never, she stood up, her voice shaking with anger. I will never humiliate myself before you like this. Then we have nothing to discuss. I stood up too, looking down at her. You leave us no choice. She shook her head. We'll leave. We'll start over in a different place. Without all this toxicity. Elliot will never leave me, I said with a confidence I didn't really feel. He knows where he belongs. You don't know your son as well as you think you do. Pearl headed for the exit, but stopped in the living room doorway. You know what the saddest part is, Austin? We could have been a real family. I really tried to connect with you in the beginning, But you didn't want that. You only wanted to control and subjugate. With those words, she walked out. I heard the front door slam, the engine of her car start, the tires rustle on the gravel of the driveway. I was left standing in the middle of the living room, feeling uncertain for the first time in a long time. What if she was right? What if Elliot really does choose her over me? Before I could finish that thought, I heard the sound of a car pulling up again. A minute later, the door opened without a knock, and Elliot walked in. His face was tense, his eyes cold and determined. I'd never seen him like that before. Elliot, I started, but he held up his hand, stopping me. Pearl told me everything. His voice sounded strangely calm. About your terms. I just wanted her to admit her mistake, I said, trying to justify myself. To be respectful. No, he shook his head. You wanted to humiliate her, break her, subjugate her, like you always tried to do to me. I felt something clench inside. Elliot had never spoken to me like that before. Son, you don't understand. I understand perfectly well, he stepped forward. All my life you've controlled me, dictating how I should live my life, what I should study, what grades I should get. Made me feel guilty for every decision that didn't go according to your plans. I wanted the best for you, I said, but even to me the words sounded hollow. No, Elliot shook his head. You wanted me to be a copy of you, an extension of yourself, not a person, but a tool to fulfill your ambitions. He started pacing the room, and in that moment I saw myself in him, the same energy, the same gestures, the same anger I'd always kept under the mask of cold logic. And you know what the saddest part is? He continued. I let you do it, always giving in, always trying to please, always feeling guilty if I didn't live up to your expectations. Elliot, but that's over. He stopped and looked at me with a determination I'd never seen in his eyes before. I'm not going to let you control my life anymore, or Pearl's life. Are you choosing her? I asked quietly. I'm choosing me, he answered. For the first time in my life, I'm making a choice without thinking about what you'll say, what you'll think, whether you'll approve of it. He stepped closer, looking me straight in the eye. Pearl and I are leaving. I've already found a job in Seattle. She's applied to several galleries there. Seattle? I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. It's on the other side of the country. Exactly, he nodded. Far enough away to make a fresh start, without your toxic influence. You can't just leave. I tried to regain control of the situation. What about your work here? Your clients? Your home? All of that can be replaced, he shrugged, but freedom and self-respect can't. I looked at my son, and for the first time I saw not the boy I'd raised, not the young man I'd guided, but a grown man making his own decisions, and that scared me more than I could admit. You're making a mistake, I said, feeling the control slipping from my grasp. Maybe, he nodded, but it would be my mistake, not yours. He headed for the exit, but stopped in the doorway, like Pearl had before. You know, Dad, he said quietly, I've always wanted your approval, your pride, but I realize now that the price for that is too high. Elliot, please, I took a step toward him, feeling something break inside me. Don't do this. Don't go. For a moment, uncertainty flashed in his eyes. Then he shook his head. Goodbye, Dad. Maybe someday we'll be able to talk again, but not anytime soon. He left, and I was left standing in the middle of the living room, listening to his footsteps recede, the door slam, the car start. Sounds that might have been the last I heard from my son. I slowly lowered myself into the chair, feeling the weight of age come upon me. At 73, I faced the prospect of being completely alone. No son, no daughter-in-law, no future grandchildren. Without the family, I always thought I did everything I did for. My revenge turned against myself. In an attempt to punish Pearl for her disrespect, I lost Elliot. In an effort to control their lives, I found myself excluded from them completely. And in that moment, I realized that my son was stronger than I had ever admitted. Stronger because he was able to do what I had never dared to do. Break the toxic cycle of control that my father had passed on to me, and I had tried to pass on to him. Elliot chose freedom, and I was left with control over things that no longer mattered. The house had always seemed spacious enough for me. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, an office, living room, dining room, kitchen, enough space to not feel cramped. But after Shelley left, the space began to expand, and with Elliot and Pearl gone, the house became an endless void in which I dissolved like a grain of sand in the ocean. For the first few days I waited, a call, a message, a visit. I hoped Elliot would change his mind, that he would realize how foolish it was to sever family ties over a single conflict. I even imagined what I'd say to him when he returned. Not an apology, of course, but something conciliatory, something that would allow us to start over. But the phone was silent. Days added up to weeks, weeks to a month, and gradually the waiting was replaced by a realization. He wasn't coming back. The fourth week after they left, I received the official notice of Pearl's dismissal from Riverbrook Gallery. The dry and formal text, signed by the director, my proxy, informed me that Pearl Drummond was resigning as curator of her own accord. Her personal belongings had already been picked up, her files transferred to a temporary deputy. I placed the notice on the desk next to the book on the Drummond family tree I'd rescued from the trash. The leather cover, slightly damaged at the bottom corner, seemed dull in the dimness of the office. I ran my fingers over the gold embossing, remembering the day my father had handed me the book. He hadn't made a long speech, just said, "You are now Drummond in the fullest sense of the word. Carry that name with dignity." And now I may have become the last Drummond. My son has given up his heritage, his history, me. The next blow came 2 months after they left. A simple white envelope mailed from Seattle. Inside was a piece of paper folded in half. Elliot's handwriting, always neat, was a little uneven, as if he'd written in haste or excitement. "Father, I have long considered whether to write to you. Pearl thinks a complete breakup would be healthier for all of us, and I'm inclined to agree with her. But I feel I must explain myself, if only for my own peace of mind. Pearl and I have started a new life in Seattle. I got a position at an investment firm. She got a job at a small but up-and-coming contemporary art gallery. We rented an apartment overlooking the bay and are slowly settling in. The weather here isn't as nice as Brooklyn Park, but we like it. I don't want anything more to do with you, Father. What you've done, manipulation, control, trying to destroy my marriage, is unforgivable. I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, to live up to your expectations. But I realize now that it was a never-ending race. You would never be completely satisfied with me, always finding something to complain about, something to fix. I'm asking you not to contact us. Don't call, don't write, don't try to find out our address. We want to build a life without your toxic influence, and to do that, we need distance, geographical and emotional. All the things Pearl gave you that legally belong to you are still in the Brooklyn Park house. You can dispose of them however you want. They don't mean anything to us anymore. Elliot." I reread the letter over and over until the words began to blur in front of my eyes. Not from tears. I hadn't cried since Shelley's funeral, but from exhaustion, from the realization of complete and utter defeat. Yes, I'd gotten my revenge on Pearl. Yes, I showed her who had the real power. But at what cost? The loss of my only son, my only heir, the only person who could still care whether I lived or died. I put the letter aside and went to the window. It was a hot August, and the trees in the garden wilted in the sun. The gardener, who came twice a week, had recently mowed the lawn, and the smell of freshly cut grass wafted into the house, even through the closed windows. This longing for something that could never be returned was unbearable. I decided to distract myself, to do something concrete, practical. I took the keys and drove to Elliot and Pearl's house, which now stood empty, for sale through a real estate agency. The realtor, a young woman with a professional smile, ushered me inside, not recognizing me as the former owner's father. The house looked impersonal. Most of the personal belongings had been removed, leaving only standard furniture and a few neutral decor items designed to create a cozy atmosphere for potential buyers. "Where are the previous owner's things?" I asked, looking at the empty walls where paintings used to hang. "Oh, they took most of it with them," the realtor replied. "The rest are in the garage waiting to be moved out. The owner said someone would be coming to get it." I nodded, realizing that someone had to be me. In the garage, I found several boxes, neatly signed by Pearl's hand. Jewelry, paintings, watches, antiques. Everything that legally belonged to me was packed and waiting for its rightful owner. I loaded the boxes into the trunk of my Lincoln and drove them home. There I began to take them apart one by one, arranging the items on the living room table. The sapphire necklace Pearl had worn for Elliot's birthday. The emerald earrings Elliot had given her for their first wedding anniversary. The Cartier watch she received for Christmas. Paintings by young artists she'd promoted at the gallery. All these things that had once caused her delight and joy now lay before me, lifeless exhibits. I looked at this collection, the fruit of my years of strategy, and felt nothing but emptiness. These items, technically belonging to me, had no value without the people for whom they were intended. What was I going to do with women's jewelry? With watches I would never wear? With paintings in a style I'd always despised? I put everything back in the boxes and took them up to the attic. Let them lie there covered in dust, like useless trophies of a pointless war. Back in the living room, I poured myself a whiskey and sat down in an armchair. The house seemed especially empty that evening. Big, luxurious, full of expensive things, and utterly lifeless. I remembered Elliot running through these rooms as a child, filling the space with his laughter. How Shelley would cook dinner in the kitchen, humming her favorite tunes. How we all sat around the dining room table together, discussing the day before. When did it all go wrong? When did I lose the ability to just love my son without trying to control his every move? When did I let my pride and lust for control replace normal human relationships? Maybe it wasn't Pearl's fault. Maybe she was just the last drop in a cup that had been filling up with years of my mistakes and omissions. I finished my whiskey and went into the study. The book on the Drummond family tree was still on the desk. I opened it, flipping through the pages of stories about my ancestors. Stubborn, proud, unbending men who'd gotten their way at any cost. On the last pages were the notes my father had made, the dates of births, marriages, deaths. I'd added Elliot's birth, his marriage to Pearl. Now there was one more entry to add, the breakup, the end of the Drummond line in my face. I picked up the pen, but I couldn't bring myself to make that entry. It would have meant admitting final defeat, resigning myself to the fact that my son was gone from my life forever. Instead, I closed the book and put it on a shelf among other family heirlooms. Let it stand there as a reminder of what I had lost, and as a symbol of hope that may have died long ago. The months passed. Autumn changed to winter. The first snow fell. I continued to live, if you could call it living. I got up in the morning, read the newspaper, sometimes counseled old clients on the phone, ate lunch alone, ate dinner alone, went to bed alone. Sometimes I checked the mail, hoping to see an envelope from Seattle. Sometimes I'd stare at the phone, imagining it would ring and I'd hear Elliot's voice. Sometimes I'd drive by the Riverbrook Gallery, thinking about Pearl and her ambition that I'd used against her. But more often than not, I just sat in my office, looking at a book on the Drummond family tree and thinking about the price I'd paid for my revenge. My strategy had worked perfectly. I got exactly what I had planned, humiliated Pearl, showed her who had the real power, made her feel helpless and dependent. I won the battle, but I lost the war, because there could be no winners in this war, only losers, and the big loser was me. I was left alone in a big empty house, surrounded by things that meant nothing, with legal rights that no one wanted, with a victory that left only the bitter taste of defeat. The Drummond family history book that Pearl had thrown away as trash and I had saved out of a sense of ancestral duty was now a symbol of a broken family bond. It contained stories of people who had lived, loved, created families, continued the lineage. And it ended with me, the man who had destroyed it all for petty revenge. One winter evening, with the snow falling quietly outside the window and the logs crackling in the fireplace, I pulled out the book again. I flipped through it, looking at the names and dates, the stories of ups and downs, the pictures of long-dead people whose blood I carried in my veins. And then I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. On the front, beneath the script, Drummond Family Genealogy, in my father's small handwriting, was an inscription, "To Austin. Remember that the most important inheritance is not land, money, or power, but the ability to love and be loved. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Your father. I stared at that inscription, not believing my eyes. In all the years I'd had this book, I'd never once noticed those words. Or perhaps I had, but I hadn't paid them any mind. Too caught up in the idea of power and control that my father preached in his actions, if not in his words. And now that it was too late, I finally realized the lesson he was trying to teach me. A lesson I had failed to pass on to my son. I closed the book and put it down on the table. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a white shroud, hiding all the flaws and mistakes under its purity. But some mistakes even snow can't hide. Some wounds don't heal with time. I looked at my phone, thinking about calling Elliot, to tell him that I understood, that I'm sorry, that I wanted to make it right. But I knew it was useless. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Some words once spoken cannot be taken back. And yet, the book lay on the table, a silent reminder of the family ties I had broken and the wisdom I had failed to realize in time. I turned away from the window and looked at the empty room, the empty house, the empty life I had created for myself. My revenge had succeeded, but the price had been too high. I had gotten what I had longed for, and I was left with nothing.